So I want to extend a warm welcome to everyone. Thank you so much for joining the webinar. We had close to 200 registrants for the webinar today. Lessons from New Implementations in New Hampshire and Pittsburgh. And today's session is hosted by the Northeast Educator Effectiveness Research Alliance with support from the Teacher Evaluation Research Alliance at REL Mid-Atlantic. So at this time, I would like to introduce Susan Mundry, who's the director of the Learning Innovations Program at WestEd and the facilitator of our NERA Alliance here at REL Northeast Islands. Good afternoon, Susan, and have a great webinar.
Thank you, Peter, and good afternoon to everyone, or good morning to those of you who are still calling in from the West. I do see that we have over 20 states represented, and that we're joined by people who work in K-12, the state education agencies, other researchers from universities, and many folks who work from the regional education laboratories and comp centers. So welcome to all of you. We're delighted you could join us today for this program. We will be sharing with you, as Peter said, some lessons learned from two studies conducted by the Regional Education Laboratory, two different regional education laboratories, one that focuses on New Hampshire and one that focuses on Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So welcome to all of you. We have quite a bit of, excuse me, we're looking for the agenda here. We have a full agenda for you today. First, our first feature presentation will be conducted by researchers at the Regional Education Laboratory Northeast Islands. Julie Reardon from EDC, who's the Director of Research for the REL Northeast Islands, and Natalie Lasarino-Piquet, who's a Senior Researcher at WestEd, will share those findings. Reflecting on that research will be Karen Soule from the New Hampshire Department of Education. This study was conducted in close collaboration with the New Hampshire Department of Ed, and she will focus on the sort of how the findings have been used and will be used in that state. And following this, our feature presentation number 2 will be Brian Gill, who's a researcher at the Teacher Effectiveness Research Alliance at REL Mid-Atlantic, and he will be sharing his study of the multiple measures of teacher effectiveness in the Pittsburgh Public Schools. And again, getting the practitioner perspective and insights, Ashley Verado, who's the coordinator of teacher growth and evaluation for the Pittsburgh Public Schools, will be reflecting on how they're using the research there in their work in Pittsburgh. You'll have ample opportunity to raise your own questions and have them answered. We'll provide some time for that, and I encourage you to, as questions occur to you, to use the chat in the lower left-hand corner of the environment to post your questions, and we will be monitoring those. Just a quick overview. Peter mentioned that the Northeast Educator Effectiveness Research Alliance is a sponsor of today's event. The NERA Research Alliance provides research to support states and districts to evaluate and improve their educator evaluation systems. We are joined today by the lead researcher for NERA, Karen Shackman, who will co-moderate with me on this event today. So as we thought about putting together this event for both our members and the broader audience joining us today, we considered that our NERA goals really focus on 3 things. Our research wants to unpack and understand what are we learning about implementation of new educator effectiveness systems. Secondly, we think it's very important to take a close look at the measures people are using and what we're learning about effective measures and effective use of measures in terms of the measures themselves, but in the calibration and the use of those measures. And third, and a growing interest of ours, is the link between educator evaluation systems and professional practice and professional growth. This session today really focuses on the first of those two goals, where we will learn in the New Hampshire study what were some of the factors that really influence implementation, and some of the insights from the initial implementation in New Hampshire, and our second goal, which is the Pittsburgh study, to understand what we can learn about the use of multiple measures in the educator evaluation system. So specifically, our goals for today would be to share these findings from the two studies I've just described, but also to provide a forum for ongoing knowledge sharing among all of you. And we encourage you, again, to use the chat to raise your questions, to post links to resources you may know about that you'd like to share with professionals working in the area of educator effectiveness, and also to continue to promote and build the capacity of participants to use research, as we've really been moving forward with this new area of educator evaluation, and to use that research to inform your practice. So without any further introduction, I would like to kick us off so that our speakers have ample time. First, joining us today is Dr. Julie Reardon from Educator Development Center, and she'll be leading our first featured presentation. Julie?
Thanks, Susan. The purpose of the study was to describe the features of the teacher evaluation system in New Hampshire's districts with School Improvement Grant, or SIG schools. Another goal was to examine the extent to which schools were implementing the evaluation systems as intended or as described in their plans. And then finally, to investigate some of the factors that were influencing the implementation during the first year that the SIG schools were implementing these new teacher evaluation systems. And to provide some background for the study and the sort of the genesis for doing this work in New Hampshire, I'm actually going to ask Karen Sewell from the New Hampshire Department of Education to say a few words about how they came to desire to know how these plans are being implemented in the SIG schools, and then we'll come back and tell you more about the study. So I'm going to just ask you, Karen Sewell, to jump in and talk a little bit about the background for the study.
Thank you. Julie asked me to give you a little bit of a context, and I think it's important, first of all, that you know that even though New Hampshire was not a race to the top state and didn't have any of those resources, our commissioner firmly believed that New Hampshire as a state, we needed to move forward with the development of a framework for educator support and evaluation. At the same time, knowing that our state has strong local governance, and at the same time, we needed to make sure that everyone was at the table in the development of our framework. The New Hampshire Phase 1 Task Force set the foundation for our support and evaluation system. It defined what effective educators look like, and it really built the 4 pillars of our system. And it truly is a system, starting with preparation, moving to induction mentoring, professional learning, and then culminating with evaluation. As this was happening, our SIG schools had been given multiple resources to improve their systems. But the results were rather disheartening. So the commissioner recommended that there be a clear direction and a clear focus. And the focus became on ongoing professional learning using one tool, and that tool was the Danielson model at that time, with ongoing professional development and also how to develop their systems, because it's not just the tool, it's also the development of the systems. To really look at how the SIG schools were implementing the Danielson with Fidelity, the commissioner asked REL and NERA to conduct a research study to determine the fidelity of the implementation of these systems. This was very important to help us move our work forward, but it was also important because it gave the SIG schools the opportunity to share and become resources for other schools and districts. This study, as it developed, helped us as we move forward with our Phase 2 Task Force report, and also helped us to consider all of our next steps. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about those pieces at the end of the conversation. And I think the other key piece that's important for people to understand is that we as a department were actively engaged in the process of this research study from the beginning to the end. And I think that's an important piece for everyone to understand, and that New Hampshire is very, very much into local governance. So everything that we do goes back to our local schools and districts for consideration. So that gives you an idea of the context, and I'm going to turn it back over to Julie.
Great. Thanks, Karen. So to conduct the study, we used three sources of data. The first were administrative documents. So these were plans that were submitted by schools and districts to the state that outlined the various features of the teacher evaluation systems to be implemented. The second were surveys. There were surveys of both evaluators and teachers. Of evaluators, and primarily these were principals responding, in some cases other administrators with oversight of evaluation. We asked questions about the training they had received and how prepared they felt to implement various features of teacher evaluation system. And for teachers, we asked similar questions about how prepared they felt to implement different features of the system. But we also asked questions about the professional climate in their schools from their perspective. For example, the extent to which the teachers felt part of decision-making at the school level and the relationships they had with the other teachers, their peers, and also with principals and other administrators in the school. And then finally, we used and conducted interviews with a small sample of teachers, principals, and district administrators from the districts and schools that participated in the study. To analyze the data, we first reviewed and then described the features of the teacher evaluation plans. To understand the fidelity of implementation, we compared the documented features that were reported in the plans for teacher evaluation against the responses from the teacher surveys in terms of what they actually experienced during the school year. So, for example, if the development of a professional growth plan was was a feature of the system, we asked the teacher whether they actually developed a plan for that year. And then finally, we analyzed survey data and interviews to understand some of the factors that affected implementation. An important outcome of this study, and Karen Sewell already talked about this, but really was the collaboration that developed between the REL Northeast Islands team and the New Hampshire Department of Education. It started, with the discussion of the study itself with the New Hampshire Department of Education leadership team, and also with input from the Alliance members, from the core planning group members. And then finally, we used an advisory committee, which is a subset of the Alliance members that participate in more regular meetings, about every 4 to 6 weeks, sometimes more frequently during key pieces of the study. But as Karen described, it really was from the very start of the study, from the refinement and the definition of the questions to ask, through the development of the survey in which this, Karen and others at the Department of Education were able to express what kinds of questions they wanted to ask about implementation and the extent to which evaluators felt prepared and trained. And then through the analysis, trying to understand what insights they had from some of our findings as we shared them through the course of the study, and then thinking about implications for the study and next steps. So it's not a finding per se, but I think a key outcome that is important to highlight. And so now to some of those key findings from the research itself. So this slide here is showing what we found about our documentation of the features of these systems. So all of the districts employed the Danielson framework for teaching. As Karen mentioned earlier, there's substantial flexibility in local control. So there were some variations in how those systems looked and some similarities. The summative rating scales were very similar across districts, but the evaluation process depended on the teacher track. And by teacher track here we mean whether a teacher was a beginning teacher on a continuing contract or a tenured teacher. The selection of the components from the Danielson framework and the weighting did vary by district, and most of the variation was in the design and the implementation of student learning objectives. And we'll say a little bit more about the student learning objectives down the road. And this slide here describes findings from our question about fidelity of implementation. And so just as a reminder, the way we measured fidelity was really more from an adherence perspective. So the extent to which teachers were reporting that they experienced in their evaluation various features that were part of their school and district's plan. And so what the short brief table shows is a moderate to high level of fidelity overall across all of the features, but we also looked at individual features and the extent to which those individual features were implemented as intended. And what we find there is that that student learning objectives were implemented with greater fidelity than some of the other features and measures of teacher effectiveness, and then classroom artifacts were implemented with a lower fidelity of implementation. And finally, our third question about factors affecting implementation. So this slide lists several factors, and I'll talk through them, and then we have slides that provide somewhat more detail on each of these, since this is a key piece of the study. So the first shown there is really the capacity of the evaluators to conduct the evaluations, and this is both in terms of time and then also resources. Training also was related to implementation. As I mentioned earlier, the introduction and development of student learning objectives, SLOs, also affected implementation. And then the last two bullets really have to do with the engagement of stakeholders in the process, the extent to which evaluators, teachers, representatives from teacher unions, and even teachers' perceptions of their professional climates in school was related to implementation. And then I'm going to turn over the next set of slides to Natalie Lasarino-Paquette to talk through in more detail what we found from each one of these factors. Natalie?
Thank you, Julie. Yes, I will. I have a few slides that provide a bit more detail on each of these factors affecting implementation. The first one that we'll address is capacity. And the finding about capacity affecting or being related to implementation is really consistent with other research on new generation teacher evaluation systems. These systems were major changes for the schools and the districts, and it took a lot in terms of time and resources for the principals and other evaluators in a school. And in New Hampshire, we saw that the principals and these other evaluators were really taking time, were really needing to adjust to this new reality. Specifically, though, principals and teachers reported that the new systems take too much time to implement all of the different components. The things that they said they were spending their time on included scheduling and conducting classroom observations and conferences. More of these were required than had been required in the past, for example. Compiling the results from the different multiple measures for each teacher took time, as well as completing and maintaining the different paperwork for all the teachers that they supervised. Despite some of these challenges of capacity, we also had evaluators report that they still managed to get all of the required components done for the most part. So that was encouraging. All right, training. On the survey that Julie talked about, we asked evaluators about the training they participated in for different key components of the system. And then we also asked how well prepared they felt to implement these different key components. And our purpose there was really to allow us
to understand whether the training seemed to make a difference or was related to evaluators feeling prepared to implement the new systems. And indeed, that's what we found. We found that initial training in the key components was positively related to feeling prepared to do the work. These bar charts show the difference in sense of preparation for evaluators who participated in the training, the blue bars, and those evaluators and principals who did not participate in training. And so just to give you an example, the top bar is evaluators who reported feeling prepared to use the domains from the Danielson framework as part of the evaluation process. 71% of the principals and evaluators who responded to the survey said they had received, who had received training reported feeling prepared. In contrast, only 13% of those who did not participate in training reporting feeling prepared. So training seemed to really matter for the principals and evaluators in these SIG schools and districts. Stakeholder support. This slide compares teacher and evaluator responses on the surveys to stakeholder support. We asked them many of the same questions around perceptions of the system to get at the idea of support. The teachers are the blue bars, and the evaluator responses are on the red bars. And what we see is that over 80% of the evaluators reported that the system is fair, compared to 69% of the teachers. This is a notable difference, but we do find that it's still a majority. So a majority of both teachers and evaluators thought the system was fair. But there was less correspondence in terms of the level of support for some of the long-term goals of these systems. If you look at the bars on the far right of your slide, I think the label for the second to last set of bars is cut off, but this is that the system will result in accurate ratings. Teachers were much less likely, or a lower percentage of teachers reported agreeing with the statement that the system will result in accurate ratings, only 45% compared to 67% of teachers. And in terms of the last set of bars, this was answers to the item, the system will improve teaching. 54% of teachers reported agreeing with that statement compared to 83% of the evaluators. Student learning objectives. This was a factor related to implementation. The introduction and design of student learning objectives was really new for the schools and districts in our study, and in many ways proved more challenging than some of the other features of the evaluation system to implement. Almost 70% of the evaluators reported having some training in this area, yet 53% of them reported being prepared to write or review SLOs. This really was a feature of the system that was newest to the district, and among the different features, there was a fair amount of variation. This is one of the features of the systems that had the most variation in how they were being used, how they were being written, how they were being evaluated. In terms of what evaluators thought they needed to feel stronger in this area, our interviews suggested that evaluators really wanted some concrete examples of what a good SLO looks like, especially at the elementary grades. They also wanted more training to ensure that their teachers were writing rigorous SLOs and that they could help them write rigorous SLOs. And then also, they wanted additional professional development in reviewing and assessing SLOs. And finally, I will talk about professional climate very briefly. We looked at the issue of professional climate and how it was related to implementation fidelity. the New Hampshire Department of Education was particularly interested in this question of professional climate and its relationship to implementation of these new systems. And so the teacher survey in particular was designed to include some measures of professional climate based on the Chicago Consortium for School Research survey. And what this chart is showing is a positive relationship between implementation fidelity and school climate, which is measured as an index of 6 concepts of professional climate, such as teacher trust and professional development and a few other items. And you can see the upward trend. Each of these diamonds is a district, and you can see as fidelity, as climate increases, fidelity also increases. So I will stop there and turn it over to Julie for some policy considerations.
Thanks, Natalie. So, so as we thought about, well, what do all these findings really mean in terms of what will be useful to folks in New Hampshire and other states and districts, this slide is showing some of our thoughts based on the findings from the study. And so the first is really assessing and addressing capacity issues for evaluators, and to the extent that that can happen before or during planning phase is helpful. The second is really planning time for implementation. In the case of New Hampshire, they allowed for almost a year of planning before implementing the new systems. And as part of that planning time, it included statewide training in New Hampshire for evaluators. One of the things we heard through the surveys and interviews is a desire for continued training. So beyond the initial training in terms of how to implement various features or even calibration of ratings, that there was a desire for continued training during the year. In particular, we heard a need for training for student learning objectives. This would be training on how to design them, how to assess whether students are reaching them, and then how to evaluate their implementation by teachers. Finally, engagement of stakeholders in the process is key. In the case of New Hampshire, there was, as Karen said at the start of the talk, a diverse task force to provide input into the state framework for teacher effectiveness, which included teachers and teacher union representatives, among many others. And this was an important part of making sure that there was consensus around that framework and a shared belief that this was not meant to be a punitive system, but one that would allow for professional growth. And so at this point, I'm going to turn it back to Karen Sewell and have her talk a bit about how the state has been thinking about these findings and working with them. If you are interested in downloading the full report, it is available. It was published earlier this year. And I will now turn it over to you, Karen. Back to you.
Thank you, Julie. The first comment I'd like to make is some overall policy considerations and things that we've already done. And I think the first one is one of our guiding principles in our Phase 2 task force was collaboration and everyone at the table in the development of individual school and district evaluation plans, because that leads to the fairness, because everyone is involved and everyone can have the difficult conversations. The second piece is the importance of ongoing professional learning. It's not just give people professional learning and then have them implement. It needs to be ongoing throughout the implementation process. And I think the most important piece for me is the focus on improving teaching. This is about our teachers improving their practice to improve student outcomes. So when we get to capacity, one of the things New Hampshire has done is provided professional learning opportunities for our principals around capacity. And we have some districts who have already implemented various ways of removing the principal from some of the management responsibilities and really focusing on instruction. The other piece that's happened is the principals have built collaborative teams so that everybody's working together on this. One of the other pieces that we have done is we now have regional meetings every month throughout New Hampshire of our principals, and that provides them an opportunity for collaboration, professional learning, as well as just having the opportunity to have time to talk about their practice. In addition, on the New Hampshire networks, we have put a variety of tools, particularly around the time piece, because that tends to be the most challenging piece in how to maximize your time and still get what you need to be done on behalf of your staff and your students. SLOs. I think one caveat you need to know is when the study was done, New Hampshire and most states were just at the very beginning of the development of student learning objectives. So New Hampshire, based on the study as well as based on our Phase 2 report, we are providing ongoing outreach to districts, first of all, to understand that SLOs are a process, looking at learning goals, setting targets, and assessments, and throughout this, the professional development link, and then how to assist them as they move forward in the process of student learning objective development. We've also provided access to materials in the writing and implementation of student learning objectives with templates that they can use as a starting point, knowing that they have total local control over this. We've also provided guides for them and walked them through the guides. I think one of the key pieces that New Hampshire has developed that's quite exciting is we have a series of learning modules that are all under 10 minutes long. They're on the New Hampshire networks. And the first is an introductory model that the commissioner introduces the modules. The second is an overview of the system supporting and evaluating educator performance. The third is measures of student performance, then an overview of student learning objectives, establishing baseline data, setting targets, and we now are in the development of assessment modules. They're all under 10 minutes, and they're wonderful opportunities to start discussions, and they are followed by discussion questions. Another important piece in New Hampshire is we have a very strong relationship with AFT and NEA New Hampshire. And NEA New Hampshire has been awarded a 3-year grant, and we are collaborating with the Center for Assessment and the Department of Education, training 30 teachers a year on student learning objectives. We'll have 3 cohorts of 30 teachers each to build the teacher leadership piece. And already some of our teachers who have been involved in this are beginning to become ambassadors, and they will be working with the next cohort in their training. I think it's also important to realize that we really make use of our individual districts telling their journeys. We have a wonderful learning path on our network that really shares the journeys of 2 very different districts in the development of their systems. And we outreach to a lot of our educators in the field because they really are the ones that are doing the work. And lastly, the New Hampshire Network, it's a social networking platform, has been an outstanding resource for us. And lastly, I think the key piece is this is about support. Our system is supporting educators on an ongoing basis, providing formative feedback to allow the professional learning opportunities to assist educators to improve their practice and therefore improve student learning. And I think that's really the message that New Hampshire is sending. And when Julie talked about artifacts, we really focus on providing evidence that demonstrates an educator's effectiveness in the various areas. So hopefully this gives you a flavor of what we're doing here in New Hampshire, remembering that it's all based on local control, but we are really very excited about the work in New Hampshire and really feel that we're building from within in our local school districts. Thank you, and I will turn it to Karen.
Thank you, Karen. I think that's very helpful to hear how you have used research to inform the supports that New Hampshire is putting in place to address particularly areas like the student learning objectives and the protocols and tools that are now available to the practitioners and building on that research. We will come back to both Karen, Julie, and Natalie after our second presentation for questions. So I will remind you again, if you have questions, that you can go ahead and put them in chat. Some of our presenters will answer you directly, but other questions we will raise to the whole group at the Q&A. So I would like to move to our second presentation and to have us hear from Brian Gill from REL Mid-Atlantic and his colleague Ashley Verado. So Brian, if you go ahead and share some of your studies, your findings with us.
Okay, thanks so much. I guess the first thing I should say is that we studied Pittsburgh's efforts to develop improved measures of educator effectiveness, and Pittsburgh had a head start on this work, which more recently has been a focus of many school districts and states around the country. Pittsburgh started looking at these issues about 6 years ago as a collaborative effort between the district and the Pittsburgh Federation of Teachers to create improved teacher evaluation measures. And that was part of a larger collaboration between the district and the union that aimed to support improved professional practice, career development, and student learning. So we took a look at some of the measures that were developed in Pittsburgh, with recognizing that the district was trying to create a vision of teacher effectiveness that would provide richer information than had typically been available in the past using multiple measures. And specifically, the measures that were being used in Pittsburgh were, as in many other places, one measure of professional practice. In Pittsburgh, they call it RISE. It is based on the Danielson framework, so similar to what's being used in New Hampshire and in many other places around the country. They also looked at a measure of student engagement, the Tripod Student Survey, which was originally developed by Ron Ferguson at Harvard University. Some of you may be familiar with that through the Measures of Effective Teaching study. And then for student achievement growth, in tested grades and subjects, they used a value-added measure that is intended to measure teachers' contributions to the growth of their, the achievement growth of their students, accounting for where those students came from. So the study then provides the first detailed analyses of the professional practice measure, RISE, along with some additional information on the value-added measures and the Tripod Student Survey scores in Pittsburgh, looking specifically at 3 questions. First of all, do the 3 measures, value-added, RISE, professional practice, and Tripod Student Surveys, do they differentiate among teachers, which is important since one of the major motivations for these changes in Pittsburgh and elsewhere was to create more differentiation than had typically been the case in the past. Second, is there evidence that these measures are valid indicators of teacher effectiveness? Are they actually successfully identifying effective teachers and distinguishing them from less effective teachers? And then third, are there ways in which the professional practice measure, RISE, might be refined and improved in the future? So those are the questions we looked at. Turning first to findings on differentiation. This chart shows you what we found in terms of the distribution of scores on the Tripod Student Surveys. And this is the kind of thing that as researchers, the kind of graph that we like to see as researchers. It's a nice, fairly normally distributed curve, which is what this particular survey scale is intended to do. That is, most of the teachers are somewhere near the middle of the scale, but you see teachers at the high and low ends as well. this is similar to a chart that you would see on the value-added scores, which likewise have a scale that's set up to show a fairly wide distribution of teacher performance. Now, there's a little bit less distribution on the professional practice measure, the RISE measure. Nonetheless, there's still quite a bit more than what you would have seen in traditional measures, which, as you know, typically only rated teachers as satisfactory or not. Here, the RISE scores range, it's a 4-point scale from 0 to 3. As you can see, most teachers earn a 2 on the scale, which is equivalent to a proficient rating. But there is some distribution around that score, and you see more of a distribution when you look at the average than when you do at individual components. For individual components, of course, teachers can only get a 0, 1, 2, or 3, whereas the average then will provide a number that can be distributed around those scores and therefore shows some more differentiation than you would see on the individual components or domains. But the bottom line here, with regard to our first research question, is that all 3 measures, professional practice, student survey, and value added, can distinguish among teachers. This is encouraging. They all differentiate more than traditional satisfactory, unsatisfactory measures do. We know that the value-added scores in particular reliably distinguish between teachers at the high and low ends of the scales. And the preliminary analyses, what we can do, suggest that the composite scores for RISE, professional practice, and tripod student surveys also reliably distinguish teachers at the high and low ends. We can't fully assess this without some additional data, but the preliminary analysis points in the same direction that suggests that they are likewise reliable. Another interesting thing that, again, I would say is encouraging in terms of whether to have confidence in these measures is that on all 3 of the measures, most of the variation we see among teachers is within schools rather than between schools. So this chart shows you the percentage of the variation that is between schools, where all the rest is within schools. And as you can see here, for all of these measures, RISE, professional practice, tripod student surveys, here for value added, we distinguish value added in terms of math and in terms of English language arts. In all cases, less than 20% of the variation represents average scores between schools. Over 80% is within schools. So what this tells us is that the principals as evaluators are in fact differentiating among teachers as intended in the professional practice measures. And moreover, this finding is consistent with lots of other research particularly on teachers' contributions to student achievement growth, that there's a lot more variation within schools than between schools. So that's good news in terms of in terms of confidence in the measures. Now, the next question related to confidence in the measures has to do with the validity of the measures. Do we have evidence that they're telling us, really distinguishing between teachers who are effective and ineffective versus something else that might not be related to teacher effectiveness? And here the findings, again, are encouraging. In particular, what we did was to examine the correlations between the 3 types of measures, the RISE professional practice measure, the tripod student survey measure, and the value-added student achievement growth measure. All of those pairs of measures are significantly and positively correlated. The correlations aren't especially large, but they do exist. They're statistically significant. And in terms of the size of the correlations, they're consistent with the prior research from the Measures of Effective Teaching study. Again, this seems like good news because we'd like to see our measures of teacher effectiveness be related to each other. That gives us more confidence that overall they are telling us something about teacher effectiveness that relates to a true underlying characteristic of the teachers. Another interesting finding from this study that is partly consistent with prior research, but to some extent a little different, is that both the professional practice ratings, RISE, and the value-added ratings in Pittsburgh we found increase with teacher experience on average. And that continues all the way out to more than 20 years of experience. So this graph shows you in blue the RISE professional practice scores, and in green the value-added scores, and gives you a sense of how both of those ratings and scores increase as you go from, all of these are relative incidentally to brand new teachers, that is, with less than 2 years of experience. So teachers with 2 to 3 years of experience do a little better in terms of value added, a little better in terms of their professional practice ratings. Teachers with 4 to 8 years do better still on both of those measures. Teachers with 9 to, I believe that should be actually 9 to 20 years, do better still. And then teachers with more than 20 years of experience in Pittsburgh have on average the highest scores. They appear to be producing the largest student achievement growth, and they get the highest ratings in terms of professional practice. Now, there are a couple of things to say about this. One is that even though this is true on average, experience still explains only a fairly small part of the total variation in scores. And what that means is that there are certainly teachers with lesser experience who are getting high scores, and there are some highly experienced teachers who are getting low scores. So it's not universally true, but it is true on average that the more experienced teachers are doing better. The second thing to say about this is that there are a few ways that this could have happened, and we can't distinguish the interpretations. So the most encouraging interpretation is that Pittsburgh's teachers consistently actually get better with experience, and that would explain this finding. But there are a couple of other possibilities too that would be different. One is that in Pittsburgh, teachers who are less effective are more likely to leave. That would be encouraging news as well. It would lead to this pattern even if teachers weren't actually improving their experience over time, because you would end up the ones who stay just happen to be the better ones. The third possibility is the least encouraging one, and that is that it could be that 20 years ago, the teachers Pittsburgh was recruiting, the new teachers that Pittsburgh was hiring were more effective than they are today. Any of those three stories could produce this pattern of data, individually or in combination. We don't have enough data to distinguish this, but in any case, it's certainly, well, I would say it's encouraging to see that there's evidence here that it's at least consistent with the notion that that the teachers may be getting better after spending more time in the classroom, though we can't confirm definitively that that's the reason for this pattern of data. Turning to the third question we looked at, what could Pittsburgh do to improve its professional practice measures? Its RISE measure. And the first thing it might do is to use multiple raters. So at the time we were doing this, Pittsburgh, like many places, was relying exclusively on principals to provide the RISE ratings of teaching practice. Now, the fact that these ratings are correlated with teacher value added, that is, teachers with higher practice scores tend to do better in terms of producing student achievement growth for their students. The fact that that's true, even though there's only a single rater producing the professional practice rating, is in one sense very good news. Those of you who are very familiar with the measures of effective teaching study may know that in that study they found this similar correlation between a Danielson practice rating and teacher value added, but they used about 4 different observers for each teacher to get that. And in Pittsburgh, they were able to do it with only one observer, the principal. Now, to me, that suggests that the principals probably know more about teachers' practice in general than just what they see on their classroom visit, and they're using that information appropriately. So that's good news. Nonetheless, at the same time, we found some evidence that that across principals, not all principals were fully consistent with each other in terms of how high they set their standards for the practice rating. So that in some schools, teachers who had approximately the same value added and the same student survey ratings might get higher professional practice ratings than in other schools. That is, the principals weren't perfectly calibrated with each other. And if you had multiple observers, particularly if some of the observers were working across more than one school, it would be much easier to make sure that the ratings were calibrated so that they're fully comparable for teachers in different schools. The findings from the measures of effective teaching study also show that using more than one observer improves the reliability of the measures. And to its credit, Pittsburgh has taken some steps to try to add data from additional observers. Another finding that's worth discussing here briefly is that there's some evidence in the data that disadvantaged students may have less access to the most effective teachers in Pittsburgh. On average, we found that African American and low-income students were more likely to have teachers with lower scores on RISE, the professional practice measure, lower scores on the student survey results, tripod, and lower value added on Pittsburgh's own local assessments, but not, interestingly, on the state assessments. Now, this is another case where there are a couple of different stories that could explain some of these findings. So one possibility is that it could be that in some way the student survey measure and the professional practice measure are biased against teachers of these disadvantaged students, that for some reason, presumably unintentionally, teachers of disadvantaged kids are getting lower ratings even if they're in fact just as good. But that shouldn't happen with the value-added measures, because the value-added measures already account for differences in student characteristics. And so when you're still seeing differences, that is, when even after accounting for the student characteristics, we're still seeing that African American kids and low-income kids are getting teachers with lower scores, that looks more like they have on average teachers who are less effective than other kids in the district do. So let me finish here with just a brief summary of the findings. I think the first key finding is that the 3 measures being used in Pittsburgh, which again are the kinds of measures being used in lots of other places, the value-added measure, the professional practice measure, and the student survey measure, they provide complementary views of teacher effectiveness, which is what they were supposed to do. All 3 measures are supporting differentiation of high and low scoring teachers. All 3 measures are correlated with each other, providing evidence that they're valid. Second key point is that principals are in fact differentiating among teachers, but it looks like their standards are varying somewhat. Most of the variation in the measures is within schools, as it should be. Nonetheless, there's an opportunity for improvement in that additional observers could improve the calibration of scores across schools, could improve fairness, and could improve the reliability of the measures of teaching practice in particular. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ashley Verrado, who is actually engaged in this work in Pittsburgh and using these results. And I'm looking forward to her giving you her perspective on the development and uses of these measures on the ground in Pittsburgh. All yours, Ashley.
All right. Hi. Hi, everyone. I know in the interest of time, I want to go over just a couple things that we have done in response to these findings and also give you all a little bit more context about the work here in Pittsburgh. So just to back up a little bit in time, Brian mentioned that Pittsburgh has been working on or had been working on setting up a system of using multiple measures to provide teachers with feedback and also to evaluate their practice for several years now. The RISE observation piece of PPS teachers, about 400 teachers of our 1,800 teachers engaged in that process of developing that system. We had the PFT, our union here in Pittsburgh, engaged in that process, and then principals and central office leaders. So that was the first piece of the puzzle, and that's by far the most developed and robust piece of our system today, and I'll talk in just a couple minutes about some things we're doing to strengthen that piece. But we wanted to create a system here in Pittsburgh that gave weight to the things that individual teachers had the most control over. So their classroom practice that they're doing every day, the students that they're supporting, and the growth that can be attributed to those students as a result. And then to give students a voice in the process was really important to us here in Pittsburgh. So we included the Tripod Student Survey. Each of those pieces was given a different weight in our system, and those weightings were arrived at through the same collaborative process that we used to design our observation system. And so we've had, a collaborative effort has been put around this for the past 5 years. We also in Pittsburgh gave teachers access to this information 1 year before it was used in evaluation. And so our RISE observation system was in use for 2 years. In the second year, we decided to give teachers a preview of their multiple measures report to give them a chance to better understand it before it was used for evaluative purposes. And we did that with each piece of the puzzle, so to speak, of what we use in our multiple measure system. So our Tripod student surveys were shared with teachers for 2 years before they were used as part of evaluation. Our value-added measures were shared with teachers for several years before they were part of their evaluation. And so we intentionally wanted to give teachers access to the information before there were evaluative stakes attached to it. So we, last year, for the first time, shared teachers' summative evaluations based on multiple measures. And this year, in about a week, we'll be doing the second round of that. So based on, some of the things Brian talked about, I'd like to share just a couple things that we've done in Pittsburgh to try to strengthen the system, specifically focused around teacher observation. So, and I would call these sort of adaptive things that we've done to try to improve the system. So one of those things is to introduce peer observers across all of our schools that serve in the same capacity as principals, but don't summatively evaluate our teachers. That group of teachers are trained in the same way that principals are and provide an additional lens on practice. And we continue to get overwhelmingly positive feedback about the availability of that support. We've also improved our principal training and observer training system. So we have about 200 observers here in Pittsburgh, and we want to ensure that the ratings that are being given to teachers are reliable and valid, and also that the feedback they're getting is reliable, is focused, is giving them some actionable next steps that they can take back into their classrooms to really improve practice. So we've revamped that system. We had a system in place for several years that was focused more on the front end part, the ratings part of that process, and have rethought that system and have relaunched that as being more focused on the feedback that teachers get and coaching our observers around how to walk teachers, through cycles of observation that are really going to give them something actionable to do. At the end of the day, the system is only as good as what teachers are able to do with it, and so we focused a lot of efforts around improving the quality of feedback and making it more actionable. We've also engaged on the technical side with a subset of teachers, principals, and central office and union representatives to continue to be responsive to the research that's come out since our system was built. So we built this system collaboratively, with teachers, with the union, with principals, but we know that research, continues to emerge around ways to improve our individual measures. And so rather than pulling 400, 500 teachers out of their classrooms multiple times a year, we established an advisory council who meets a few times a year, reviews research around each piece of our system as it's relevant, prioritizes certain things that they might want to change or adjust that could have a meaningful impact on how the system works for teachers, and then makes recommendations to our superintendent that are reviewed and either will be implemented in the following school year or, for whatever reason are not implemented and become a part of discussion in the following year. So this was our first year engaging in that advisory council, and a few recommendations were made from that council that will improve the way that the observation system and also our value-added model look moving forward. And so I think, just understanding that the information that Brian shared, the context here in Pittsburgh, and the balance of continuous improvement of the system with wanting people to understand the way that they're evaluated and be able to focus more on instruction than on understanding, updates and changes over time is important to us. I think, to one of the points Brian brought up, the improvement of multiple observers. I talked a little bit about peer observers, but we continue to think about other ways that we can have more eyes on practice across our schools, within our buildings, to think about ways that we can provide teachers with more feedback from multiple sources that will allow them to grow their practice is really important to us, and so we're continuing to think about ways that we can do that better. I'll stop there because I know we want to have some time for questions.
Thank you, Brian and Ashley, for that presentation. I think both the New Hampshire presentation and the Pittsburgh presentation raise a number of sort of key messages around implementation and sort of reflection on the educator evaluation systems. You both raised the importance of the collaboration, of the careful timing for implementation, and for sort of using research to sort of guide your continuous improvement. So we have a number of questions that have come up in the chat, and also some questions that were included when we began, when we had registration. So I want to start with just a couple of those, and then I'll turn it over to my colleague Karen Shackman to ask us some questions from the chat directly. So just to begin with, for Brian, we had a question in our initial registration of someone who wanted to learn more about whether there's research that sort of strengthens the argument for using student achievement data as a valid measure of teacher effectiveness. And I wonder if you could speak to that just to our group today.
Sure, I'd be happy to. There have been some existing studies on that issue. The Measures of Effective Teaching study is a prominent one, and one of the things they did in that study was to use what we call a gold standard research design, randomly assigning students to teachers or teachers to classrooms, and then check to see if the value-added measures that they had measured for the same teachers in an earlier year predicted the student achievement growth when you had a randomized experiment, and it turned out they predicted them quite well. So that was encouraging. That was encouraging on the specific issue of saying, well, can these statistical adjustments in the value-added measure actually create a sort of level playing field among teachers? Can they really successfully factor out differences that are related to the kids rather than the teachers and to other things outside the teacher's control? That's good news. But of course, you might have a different idea about what validity means here. What it means to say that the measure truly represents teacher effectiveness. And so, for example, if you think that you've got a really great measure of teachers' professional practice and you're confident that your measure of professional practice is fair and is a good measure of true teaching effectiveness, then I would say that the findings from our own study here in Pittsburgh, as well as the related findings from the Measures of Effective Teaching study, are likewise encouraging. In both cases, we found that the value-added measures are significantly correlated with the professional practice measures, suggesting that that they are capturing aspects of the same concept.
Thank you, Brian. So we have a few questions in the chat that are somewhat related, so I'd like to go ahead and turn it over to Karen to raise a few of those questions.
Great, thank you. This is Karen Shackman, not Karen Sewell. Karen Shackman from the REL. We have a few questions in the chat related to the use of tripods specifically, and so I thought both Brian and Ashley might share a little bit about the use of tripod and what percent of the overall teacher evaluation is allocated to the student perception surveys, as well as, Brian, if you would explain a little bit about the way you talked about bias with regard to the use of tripod and how there might be bias embedded in the use of tripod, if at all.
Yeah, that's a great question. This came up in the context of talking about the fact that the tripod student survey results and the professional practice results showed a relationship to whether teachers had more students who were low income and more students who were African American. Now, as I mentioned, there are two reasons that kind of relationship might happen. So in particular, low-income students and African American students tended to have teachers who had lower scores. Necessarily mean they're biased. It might, in fact, be telling us explicitly what you might initially believe it to be telling us, which is that those disadvantaged kids are more likely to get teachers who are less effective. And in fact, that is probably the most likely explanation, particularly given that some of the value-added measures are showing the same thing and they actually adjust for student characteristics. But we can't totally rule out the possibility that those teachers are getting lower scores on the student surveys and or on the professional practice measure just because, well, in the case of the student surveys, it could be that different kinds of students respond differently to the same instructional environment, in which case teachers, in theory, could be getting lower scores just because they happen to have more of the kind of students who tend to respond with lower scores. Again, we can't demonstrate that that's the case, and I would say it's more likely, given the totality of the evidence, that that the measures aren't biased, and in fact they're telling us something real about a distribution of effective teachers that isn't quite equal across different sorts of students in the district.
Thank you. Brian, there are several more sort of specific questions about the use of the student surveys. For example, Gregory Collins asks about the 7C scores and if they've proven stable across the years. Maybe you would answer that, and then I'd love to turn to Karen Sewell and raise a question to New Hampshire and the New Hampshire researchers.
Yeah,
so Brian, if you would say a little bit about the... Explain what the 7C scores are.
The 7C scores are a particular part of the tripod measure, which are the main ones being used. And we actually have only analyzed 1 year of Pittsburgh's data, so I don't know the answer to that question, although it's possible that Ashley has some more recent data and might be able to answer that. I believe that other evidence on the tripod and 7Cs suggests that they are reasonably stable across years.
I can answer that. So yes, what we've seen is that the 7C scores, we use NCEs related to those scores when we actually use the survey results in an evaluation. So we're not using just one administration of the survey. We're actually using 2 years of survey administrations, and then we're using NCE score ranges when it's applied to evaluation. And so I can send, for folks who are interested, more literature about its use in our combined measure. But yes, we've seen stability in those scores across years.
Thank you, Ashley. And if you want to post anything related to that to the chat, please feel free to do that, and folks can access it right away. I wanted to turn our attention back to New Hampshire and to Karen Sewell at the New Hampshire Department of Ed and the researchers for the study. There is a question that came up early on about the extent to which evaluators really have the capacity and the training to provide high-quality feedback related to the evaluations, and how, whether or not Karen in New Hampshire, or if the researchers could say anything about evaluators' capacity related to feedback, and what New Hampshire is doing to kind of build evaluators' capacity around providing high-quality feedback aligned to the evaluations. So first, let me turn it to you, Karen Sewell, to give us a little information about, maybe a little more about how you in the state are doing that, and if there's anything that bubbled up in the study, then I'll turn it over to Julie and Natalie to speak to that.
I think that's definitely an area of concern here in New Hampshire. And Bob Manso, who was our lead for our principal evaluation, has already begun to work with the regional leads for the principal regions, and they are looking into how best to tackle that, because we see that as definitely a need. It's come out in every one of our regions, so that is definitely something that is on our radar screen. I think in addition, we have a very close relationship with our higher education, both teacher and leader programs, and we have also shared this area of concern with them to assure that as they are preparing their leaders, that this is a conversation and training that they have. So that's really where we are with that at this point.
Thank you, Karen. I'm going to turn it over to Julie to speak a little bit about the research related to this important issue.
Yeah, thanks, Karen. I would say that one of the things that we heard in the interviews, not so much in the surveys, was that there is sort of a desire to have a way to organize some of that feedback, materials to organize it, be it more developed protocols or an actual software program that would provide a systematic way to provide that kind of feedback. So in some of those we interviewed, something like that was in place, a software to actually group the feedback across these multiple measures, and then to organize it in a way that provides feedback to teachers in a conference setting. I recall in one interview there was even the use of an Excel spreadsheet to kind of do that. But I would say our study focused on that first pilot year of implementation, and so really I don't think some of those things were fully in place. But those are the kinds of things we heard in the interviews, and I think anecdotally I've heard, in other places as well, that sometimes even having a software program to organize some of that feedback helps to systematize it. And I'm not sure if it totally gets to this question about quality feedback, but the idea of having some protocols to walk through those conversations is another part of that.
Thank you, Julie. I realized that maybe Ashley, from your perspective in Pittsburgh, you might like to say something about any work that the district is doing related to this critical issue of how evaluators then use the data to provide high-quality feedback to teachers on practice improvements.
Sure. So in Pittsburgh, we have used our own internal data warehousing system to provide teachers with what we call an Educator effectiveness report when they receive their summative evaluation. That's in addition to the reports that they get about each individual measure throughout the year and the feedback they get from regular classroom observations. But we've tried to provide teachers with more information so they can understand their results and then do something with it. We every year have held training for principals where they receive copies of the reports for the teachers who are currently in their building and have a chance to talk about what feedback they would want to give that teacher to start the year, and then have subsequently followed that up with some guides around conversations, how to have conversations about what the results are saying, how to interpret the results, what next steps you might want to recommend a teacher take, just specifically around their summative evaluation. But for observation specifically, we use Bloomboard here in Pittsburgh, and it sort of does what Julie was describing in terms of aggregating feedback, but it is just focused on our student learning objectives and our observations. So it doesn't include our student survey results or value-added results.
Thank you very much. I'm going to turn it over to Susan, who's going to take us in a slightly different direction of discussion, and we invite folks from out there in the world to chime in and give their answers and thoughts and responses related to the question that she's going to raise to our presenters. These questions about what we're learning are having technical difficulties. Now, to think about, given what we've learned, what are the questions that both that you think could be informed by parent goal? What are some of the new questions that implementation or about measures?
We're having some technical difficulty. We'll ask Susan to restate her question for us.
We're having a little trouble with our audio, and so I just want to make sure that we're coming through now, and we're wanting to ask Karen Sewell to reflect on the question of, given what we've learned from research, what are your new questions? What areas of new research do you think could inform both implementation and information about measures? Karen?
That's a very interesting question. I think that continuing on with the research around multiple measures of student outcomes as well as multiple measures of measuring teacher and educator effectiveness. And I think that really is the key piece. because we talk about it, but really what are those multiple measures and how can they support our educators as they move forward. And I think that's important in the whole realm of assessment, because people think they understand assessment, but as we outreach in the field, we're discovering that people really don't have a basic understanding of assessment. So those would be my areas.
Thank you, Karen. Very helpful, and I think we're seeing the same out in the field, helping to develop people's understanding of assessment literacy and improving our capacity to use data to make informed choices. So let me turn to Ashley with the same question. What new questions do you have either about implementation or about measures that you think would be informed by research?
That is a great question. I'm interested in how we've focused a lot of our efforts on teachers and how we support teachers and how we provide them with good information. I'm interested in how principal evaluation is going to look and potentially inform how we want to train that group better, differently. We're just starting, selfishly here in Pittsburgh, we're just starting our process of really evaluating principals based on multiple measures. And so I'm interested to see if there are correlations between, principals' skills and strengths and how teachers are evaluated by that group.
Well, and we have, I think, many researchers listening in today, and so maybe, Ashley, they will pick up your call for research on the principal evaluation process and also the training of the evaluators of principals. I think that is a next wave. I think another couple of...
If anyone's interested.
Okay, great. Another couple of connections I just wanted to make. I think that the Pittsburgh example provides such a great argument or case for making sure that districts that have the capacity to examine their measures and can begin to think about how well we're really reaching calibration, and then use that data to make ongoing improvements and provide training for our evaluators is really critical. And the findings around the question of whether some of our most disadvantaged students are actually being taught by our most effective teachers is another area, I think, that's suggested in your research as all the states are now moving to implement equity plans to make sure that educators who are effective are in front of every child. I think having more information like that will be very, very helpful to monitor that process. And so those are just a couple of other areas that I think we could pursue have some implications for future research. So I want to turn now just to sort of wrap us up. We have just a few more minutes. We would like to thank our presenters today, both to the field has been just very, very helpful, and I think useful for particularly the practitioners we heard from today, both in the New Hampshire State Department as well as in the Pittsburgh Public Schools, but I think more broadly to inform this sort of next generation of educator evaluation. We invite all of you to stay in touch with us and with our presenters to learn more about the work as it moves forward. I would like to ask you all, as soon as we wrap up, you will see a link to the stakeholder feedback survey. We would very much like to get your feedback, what you found useful, what you found helpful in today's event. So I would like to just ask you to do that. In closing, again, here is contact information for my colleague Karen Shackman and I. We together lead the Northeast Educator Effectiveness Research Alliance. If you'd like to learn about any more of our work, I would ask you to just get in touch with us. And also contact information for the Teacher Effectiveness Research Alliance at REL Mid-Atlantic, and to follow more of their work and to get in touch with Brian or Ashley. We thank you all again for your participation, and I'll turn this over to Peter for the close.
Thank you so much, Susan, and everyone who joined today. On behalf of REL Northeast Islands, I also want to thank REL Mid-Atlantic for their contribution to the webinar. In 2 or 3 weeks, you'll all receive a thank you email from us with a link to the archived webinar today. And yes, we appreciate your completion of the feedback survey. Have a great rest of the day. Bye-bye.